Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about, the royal we are going to talk about the injury ontology. So as is maybe no surprise, injury already seems relevant in the room, given the dental fear and anxiety ontology folks. It's relevant across a number of different domains, as you imagine, the dental people, the medical people, legal data is often tracking kind of injury and its relation to various, incidents in the law. The military obviously has a vested interest in being able to coordinate data about injury, as well as the sports medicine people. It's actually quite a wide-ranging field. So we're in need of an injury ontology of sorts to help aggregate and coordinate all this data. There we go. So as to not just totally try and reinvent the wheel, we can look, there is a representation of injury, this term, in the ontology of general medical sciences. They define an injury as an injury is a disorder that involves some structural damage that is immediately caused by a catastrophic external force. So this is where we started our thinking. I think this is like a fine kind of first go at representing what injury is. But I'm going to go through this talk and just kind of discuss our proposed broader definition of what an injury is and sort of some of the ways in which we might create subtypes in order to classify a more capacious category of injuries as it's more appropriately discussed across all of these various domains. So just to bring some levity to the topic, I have our notion of injury, which I'll get into in just the next slide, would actually maybe model this notion of injury as being a specific type of injury, not injury writ large, but maybe an acute bodily injury, right? We have this clause in here about how injuries are caused by a catastrophic external force, like this car somehow launching into a home. All of the injury that may or may not have been caused by this catastrophic event would certainly be a kind of injury, one done to the body, but all owing to some sort of really strong acute force. But we have certainly other kinds of injuries, like carpal tunnel is something, a kind of injury that's developed over slow exposure to sort of these micro traumas. So we need an ability to represent all kinds of injuries. So our proposed kind of broad definition is actually specifically about bodily injury. We have a colleague in the dental school who's motivated to help us represent other kinds of injuries that aren't even bodily, psychological injuries, moral injuries. So we're even being more specific than just injury writ large. We're talking specifically about bodily injury. So our proposed definition, we start again kind of with the inspiration from Agams by calling it a disorder that results from some energy transfers between some portion of body tissue and its environment, where the amount or rate of energy transfer exceeds the body tissue's tolerance. I'll go through it because I know it's a little bit of a mouthful. A disorder. This is a term from Agams. It's defined as a material entity which is clinically abnormal and part of an extended organism. So I think the most important part here is the clinical abnormality. So to say an injury is a disorder is to say it is an entity that is clinically abnormal, right? So little maybe small tears that happen like in the finest of I don't know, paper cuts or something wouldn't constitute an injury simply because it doesn't rise to the level of clinical abnormalities unless for some reason that became clinically relevant. It wouldn't count as a disorder by virtue of not counting as being clinically abnormal. So right, the rupture in your arm or something, or the inflammation in your wrist would count as something that's clinically abnormal. Energy transfers, so a disorder that results from some energy transfers. We define energy transfers kind of broadly. This is almost straight out of like a physics textbook, as simply a process by which energy is relocated from one entity to another. And there are many different kinds of energy transfers that are involved when we're talking about injuries. So we have probably the most I don't know, canonical kind of injury or energy transfer that is involved in those catastrophic events, right? Where there's some one-off high impact force that exceeds the tissue's tolerance to withstand that force, such that it causes some kind of rupturing. So that's one kind of energy transfer pattern that is involved. Other kinds of energy patterns that are involved in injury, right, might be injuries from reoccurrent moderate force, right? Like you think of the person who's operating a jackhammer over and over and over again, right? There's like a kind of a moderate force associated with that, that over time will lower the tissue tolerance and then cause injury. Similarly, with a repetitive force, sustained load injury is going to involve a kind of energy pattern that is related to, maybe you could think of like maybe kneeling as an example of a sustained force injury, where kneeling for long periods of time is going to apply a pressure slowly such that the tissue tolerance again is reduced, and then at some point there's a threshold which is crossed and the tissue tolerance is exceeded, causing some kind of injury. So this helps us in terms of just building out the injury ontology. We can start to create subtypes. You can create defined classes. We could get into the details if you have any questions about specifically how we would do this. But we could create different types of injuries essentially by specifying what kind of energy pattern was involved in creating the injury. So for instance, I've just, as an example, and I'll do this kind of throughout the talk about acute injuries, right? An acute injury is an injury that results from some acute energy transfer. We can do this for like cumulative microtrauma energies and, so forth. We can also specify different subtypes of injury by talking about the type of energy that is involved, right? We have solar energy or UV rays and whatnot, kinetic energy, thermal energy, sonic energy, right? Energy because, a large bomb went off near you and it's exploded your eardrum, right? So we can specify not only the pattern of energy involved in the injury, but also the type of injury. I have here as an example the definition of what we might call a thermal injury, which is an injury that results from some, thermal energy transfer. We can specify different types of injury by talking about different portions of the body, and this will involve like importing lots of terms from like an anatomy injury, like Operon, for instance, where we can just talk specifically about the body region where injury is obtained. So I have here, again, inspired by one of my colleagues on this grant, the temporal mandible joint injury. It took me a while to say that word. Which is defined as an injury located in the temporal mandibular joint. So again, relatively easy as far as just, standing on the backs of those who've created the various anatomy terms in the Operon ontology. We can also talk about injuries and define different kinds of injuries based on the context in which they've occurred. So certain energy patterns are a part of maybe the work that you were carrying out. For this, I'm highlighting kind of the ways in which we can reuse terms in other ontologies. So there's the occupational ontology that maybe I think some people in this room perhaps even worked on. There's a term in there called occupation activity. We could very simply co-opt that term and develop a new one called occupational activity injury, which is simply an injury that results from some energy transfers, which is an occurrent part of some occupation activity. This is going to make it such that all of the data that people are, tagging with the occupational ontology will now be interoperable with our injury ontology, because again, the importance of reusing terms. The kind of last sort of central part of this is to discuss the energy transfer exceeding the tissue tolerance. Actually, I think the highlight is in the wrong place. This is supposed to be over tissue tolerance. So tissue tolerance, we define as simply a disposition that inheres in some tissue that, if realized, is realized when the tissue participates in some energy transfers without resulting in injury. So these are dispositions, realizable entities that inhere in some body tissue. They are materially grounded in like tissue qualities. So like the density of your bones, the elasticity of your tendons, the porosity of your muscles, that kind of thing. Those sorts of things determine how tolerant your tissue is to withstanding energy transfers without causing injury. So kind of putting it all together here, I just have a way, kind of design pattern in which we might model sort of an instance of shin splints. Right, we have a person who has 2 legs. The second leg we're going to model is where the injury has occurred. They have a certain a tibia, right, a bone, a material part, which participates in a tearing process. Supposing, you know, you've run too many times and that has torn various elements in the tendons of your shin, which has a certain site in the bone or the muscle. It's a tissue tear. The tibia also has a certain disposition, right? The tissue tolerance, which is materially grounded in, say, a tissue quality we might call tissue porosity. This is kind of how we would model it maybe over time. This is actually distinguishing between what we'll call like the injury process writ large and then individual instances of energy transfer events. So suppose this is an instance of shin splints that have developed over the course of 4 different running events. The first event causes some sort of tibial micro tear. That's the output of this process. Another energy transfer, the running time 2, has additional micro tears. Energy transfer 3, additional micro tears, additional micro tears. Ultimately, collectively, those constitute what we're going to call an injury process, because the collection of those individual instances are what ultimately cause the disorder we call shin splints. So each individual one is not itself injurious, but the collection of them are. Just to end, I have here just sort of a representation of some of the terms that we are inviting into the injury ontology, as well as some that we're reusing from Ubron, the ontology of biomedical or biological attributes, Oghams, BFO. Thank you all for listening.